Can you hear me, everybody?
Yeah.
Okay, so welcome everyone to the third night of the Gainesville Jewish Film Festival, the 11th annual Gainesville Jewish Film Festival. Our film today was Tomorrow When the Apricots Bloom, which I really liked. And discussing the film this evening is Dr. Gail Zachman, who teaches French Jewish studies. So this is very apropos for the film, but also apropos is the fact that she has just completed the final edits on her own film, which some of you have seen earlier cuts of. Kojo, a wonderful story about it's a long story about a French Jew whose father was killed in the Holocaust, who later has a key role in the Entebbe hijacking, not the actual hijacking, but the rescue of the group that was hijacked to Entebbe. Anyway, without further ado, Gail Zachman to discuss Tomorrow When the Apricots Bloom.
Thank you, Norman. Thank you, Virginia and Jack, for selecting this one. For me, it's not, spot on my area, Egyptian Jews on the one hand. And for those of you who remember when Kojo started, I'm not really an animation person, but I found this film absolutely fascinating and incredibly well done. Bukha Film Mishmish, When Pigs Fly, was the story of the failure of a mission by the three Frankel brothers, Shlomo, David, and Herschel, who were an extraordinary success in Egypt. For those of you who saw the film, I don't know if everyone's seen it. And what I really loved about this film, the director is Tal Michael, and I didn't know her before, but I'm glad I do now, because I thought it was extraordinary the way she has woven together the story of the Frankel brothers and their place in Egypt and in the history of animation, along with the history of immigration, Marcel's story. So there are numerous restorations going on. The restoration of the Frankels into animation history, but it's done through the restoration of the film itself. And I really loved the way she restored Marcel's story, because she said she didn't want the story of her, husband and his two brothers, but she wanted her story to be told. And these form a sort of microhistory, if you will, of Egyptian Jews who, sort of a diaspora story, an immigration story. And what was interesting to me was we haven't had that many films that deal with Mizrahi Jews. I think Midnight Orchestra was one, sort of North African Jews, Timona Twist. But in terms of immigration docs, and I'm sorry Alice isn't here because she deals with immigration and ethnic cleansing this semester, Israel Y, we did, which is one of the few that focused to some degree on Mizrahi Jews and Moroccan Jews. And in that pecking order that he establishes, Claude Lanzmann, he has Ashkenazi Jews and spends a fair amount of time on Mizrahi Jews, in particular Moroccan Jews. But that pecking order is German, then really Iraqi, Egyptian, and then the North African Jews. So Dimona Twist dealt with, again, Moroccan Jews. And recently, and this is why I'm prefacing it, Roy and I were speaking of Atzal Fokalim, which is a play on Sephardi, the word Sephardi in Hebrew, the word Moroccan in Hebrew, and the word French in Hebrew. So it's this valise pejorative term that's used to talk about the movement of Francophone Jews. So this is one of the few films that deals with Francophone Jews. Hello, Goodbye is also an immigration story between France and Israel, Aliyah. But this one's particularly interesting to me, not because I work on Egyptian Jews, because when my colleagues used to make comments in France or in or in Germany about how secure they were in the early 2000s, I would just remind them and that, even though we see many more Holocaust films, there was a mass exodus out of North Africa and the Middle East. So, nearly 1 million Jews. Egypt's population in 48, because in the film, 48 is a marker. That's when Marcel starts to talk about how difficult it becomes. There are about 75,000 Jews in Egypt, and now there are under 10. So that movement I thought was really interesting, the fact that she gets in the immigration story. She also gets in another immigration story, and that's the opposite of this new series on Francophone Jews, Al Sofa Karim, that we were talking about. In that series, Israel is seen as badly receiving or not well integrating and preparing for Mizrahi and even French Jews. And France is seen as a place where one can immigrate and integrate easily. This shows that the ethnic pecking order, if you will, in Israel or within Israel is very distinct from that of what happens in France after 1956 and the mass immigration of Middle Eastern and North African Jews. So I thought she did an amazing job of that. In terms of the film itself, the visuals were extraordinary. I really enjoyed the way she narrated it through David's story, one of the brothers, and then told their story through the animations themselves. So the film takes their story, but it's run throughout. I mean, she paid for all of the restoration of their films. So in that opening sequence, before the intro credits, you see him seeing the film. She's actually filming when he sees it for the first time. So I don't want to make an enormous number of comments because I'm assuming you're going to have questions. I just wanted to give some axes and some direction, and maybe a touch more on what was difficult for these animation pioneers who really made it big in Egypt before they left, and that painful story that Marcel doesn't want to tell, which is the story of their failure in France or their difficulty assimilating, because in France, that ethnic pecking order would be very different. Algerian Jews would be citizens. It would be easier for them to integrate. Certain Moroccan Jews would find it easy to integrate, but the majority that would be coming over from Tunisia, Morocco, and other countries would not have the facility or the community to enter into France as easily. And there are a number of indications of these ethnic pecking orders in the different countries. Marcel complains that she's seen pejoratively as the Sephardi in the family, and she uses the word Schwarzkopf or Schwarze pejoratively to talk about, and she interestingly attributes it to hair, which of course is generous. And what happens is that in France, there's a different pecking order, and she's still sort of at the bottom of the rung, but she's dealing with very different kinds of tensions. So I'd like to sort of open it up to whatever you're most interested in. I hope you enjoyed it, because I thought the editing was extraordinary on this. And, you know, even the chapters, Israel, the chapter headings, the stills from the animations were visually delicious. So I'll just, I guess, open it up.
Oh, she's making films and she's French. It's totally her.
Yeah.
Can I just point out one detail on the comment? I don't know who made it, but this is a Franco-Israeli production, and I think that that's really interesting because
documentary was very
post-Israel, in fact, French and Egyptian relations and North African relations will change radically. And I know it took her a number of years to make the films, about 7 years. But I did notice that one of her producers is Yael Abakassis, which means it would be really easy to get funding. For those of you who know her, Jack, I don't know if he's here, he knows or has met her at the festival. She's the lead female and a producer in her own right of Prisoners of War. She's the wife, the good wife, for those of you who've seen that Israeli series. So I'll just open it up to questions.
Gail, sorry if I missed this when you introduced it, but I couldn't understand the wife, I think her name was Marcel, who was she angry at, or who did she think had wronged her? I didn't
No,
get-
that's great because I didn't fill out the story, and I said I wouldn't do summary unless students were here. So Marcel, the brothers come over. They're from Belarus, right? They come to Israel. They situated in Jaffa, and she has a love story with him, which they play out. I love that in animation, completely transforming the animations. But they're Ashkenazi Jews, and we don't really know her origins. We know she was there in Israel. She marries him. She meets him. And I didn't recall, and I honestly, it was a kind of crazy week. Didn't get to screen it this week. If she talked about where she came from, but for her, for them, she was other. She was, yeah, she was Black. And that's, that discontent with an ethnic pecking order in Israel is similar to what we see in the television series, that's Ofokaim. And when they get to France, you see that France is no longer the home of the happy Jew. And the integration story that you see in Khalili's series is not a happy integration series. The daughter comments on how his accent would have worked against him. He doesn't have the same education. Even if they go to the Lycée Français, they're not quite as culturally competent and linguistically competent as those who are coming in from Algeria at the same time. So, their great dreams encounter quite a bit of difficulty. She's embarrassed by their clothing. The class distinctions are poignant. It's interesting because Elkin has a book on actually education, and she talks about the sort of pecking orders between Tunisian and Moroccan Jews, but she really doesn't deal with Egyptians who come in, who have a split. There's a class split. So some in the intelligentsia will find it easier if they have connections, but it's a more difficult integration. I don't know if you wanted more on Marcel, because I kind of loved her.
Yeah, I guess I was interested too.
Tell
'Cause
me.
it sounds like she was always of modest means. So did her situation actually get worse, or did it?
So she's interesting, and actually, Tom Michaels said that she's the story she went with. She had an immigration story. She had an animation story. She's going to restore all those. She's going to restore the films, but she was really interested in Marcel's story. And Marcel talks about herself really as a prisoner. When you get to chapter 2, Departure for France, this is when she says, I thought I was going to Israel. And in fact, when I got to Marseille and the cases didn't fit or weren't going, this is what they told me. They lied to me. She says her letters were censored. She seems to have been, in conflict, but also when you look at the last chapter, when they talk about Blue Danube, right? It's clear, or it becomes clear that they used all of their money, that they already weren't well off, and that whatever savings they had also spent. So the hardship story is there. What I found, it's a beautiful song of unsung pioneers. The happy ending in Egypt is wonderful, seeing that the community is now being recognized. But her story is a tragic one. She's very hot and cold, and I very much enjoyed her as a character, nonetheless. And the scenes where they're playing games and she's refusing to speak about her suffering, which, she talks about 48. She calls out 48. So clearly the Jewish quarter, I'm assuming it's an allusion to the Jewish quarter bombings, was a marker for her and sort of the end of that happy multicultural place, and her husband's fame. The person that she married was an up and coming star. And then she had to live with her in-laws.
I thought that also when she referred to when she was in Egypt, she married one man. When she got to Paris, she found she married a palm with 5 fingers.
Right.
And so, she was not expecting all the brothers to live downstairs in their house. I think She
She
was,
believed he was going to Israel. She believed she was going to Israel. She says that they tricked her, and you're right. She was absolutely trapped. And that's another, I mean, interesting item is, Middle Eastern and North African Jews after 48, the choice between France and Israel is a tough one, but many will go to France because they feel that they'll integrate better. These are Francophone Jews. So whereas she wanted to go to Israel, they wanted to go to France, which was cutting edge in animation. And Israel had no industry. So here they are, these pioneers creating a cartoon company in Egypt, and they go to France because they think it'll be easier for them, when in fact it was much more difficult. And yes, she did seem to be living with quite a number of adversaries in the house.
So that question I had about who she was angry with, was she, because I guess I thought, was she actually angry with her husband, or felt sort of
The intention, I don't know. Certainly, she talks about, she says he loved us. She did fall in love with him. The love story is there at the beginning, and I just adored the way they did the animation and the sort of nostalgia and idealization of Egypt, which was really at the time a welcoming home. But certainly she seems to reserve it more for the people upstairs and for the atelier downstairs. So, but I particularly, love the treasure hunt aspect of it, the going through the boxes, the smelling the reels, the seeing what they had. Another interesting thing was they really were inventors and experimented, and that sort of play between American Disney, they call them Disney of the Middle East, animation and French, and what's going on in France, because the home footage that they used and that they found during this 7-year quest is actually 9.5 millimeter. So that's pretty, Mo, correct me, am I wrong? I mean, 9.5 millimeter, like, can you hear me, Hen? 9.5 millimeter, I don't hear people talk about. And that's because it's French film. You're on mute, honey. That's Pathé film, right?
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
the before 8 millimeter and 16 millimeter, 9.5 millimeter was the amateur gauge.
Yeah.
That was generally used throughout Europe.
So they had, and the Middle East, so they had, French product, if you will, that they were working with in their home movies. And then they were also starting and eventually went to Super 8. So in terms of film history, sort of engineering, visual technologies, because they made their own viewing box, they were really fascinating characters and perfectionists, if the tale is told correctly. But certainly she seems to have wanted her husband to not be in business with his brothers or in the cartoon business.
Yeah, she's definitely resentful, and you can feel that through the entire film. I mean, the film works, right? We have the one sort of professional aspect, the restoring of the film and their work of animation, and then Marcel is the one that's in charge of telling the story of the family. I think mostly because she's kind of the sole survivor, right, from that lineage. She's the only one that can talk about what happened in first person. I think what's fascinating about her is how she really refused to talk about the films themselves. She never wants to respond to questions about the quality of the movies, or she's really kind of refusing to admit that they were good filmmakers. And only when they show the films to the family, right, the restored movies, then you see that she gets suddenly emotional. And but you imagine that this is a woman who would be like exposed firsthand to these movies as they were made, but she's she kind of comes out really removed from her husband's and brother's life work. I think mostly because she sees it as it's symbolizing all of her hardships, all hardships that she went through, right? The being away from the family and and also the resentment of the two other brothers who kind of stayed bachelors, right? They never married, so they were angry, and she sees the films as the reason for that.
Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, so the narrative is woven between David's letter, and we don't know to whom that letter is going, where, you know, he's describing her as a wicked, horrid person. So you get some indication of the degree of animosity. Without doubt, they're writing for and asking for aid and support from the government, and trashing the sister-in-law for it. So yes, there were definite tensions within that household. She did seem to, and when she mentions the censoring of her letters to her family, what I found a little bit, the only thing that's not successful, and Mo, I hope you jump in and talk about some of the visuals, because you can do them, but I don't talk about them. Because I love the work with photography. But I found that even though she said she wanted to tell Marcel's story, she does reintegrate the Franco brothers into animation history. She does a good job on the microhistory of immigration, North African and Mizrahi Jews in France. But I'm not sure that she gets Marcel's story out. Marcel's reticence, the sort of bittersweet ending with their work being recognized nonetheless. But I'm not sure that the story that Marcel said she wanted to tell is ever told. But she was a great character to revolve around, I think.
Maybe not, because I go even farther than Roy. She seems to have an almost, maybe it's just me, a schadenfreude over the failure of these films, which, you know, it's almost like she's watching them at the end and she doesn't want to watch them because she doesn't want to acknowledge that they're good.
Yeah, no, she was hoodwinked into going there with them. And
I'm sorry, say that again?
Yes, she says she was hoodwinked into going there with them.
Yeah, yeah.
Her life is a miserable life. No, she doesn't make qualms about that. But what I'm saying is we don't get a whole lot of it. And I'm sure it was a lot worse. And there aren't any opportunities, right? She's brought over. She can't work. This is France of the 1960s, and she's Egyptian with an accent. So lycée français images, all you like, that's not going to work when 800,000 pieds noirs are rolling into France in one decade. So. Comments, questions?
I had a question about their animation.
Good, Mo. Yeah.
It's for you, but maybe I'll put Roy on the spot too. There's this literature out there. There's a little bit of field, but there's this literature out there about Jewish comic book writers in the United States in the 30s, and there's a guy writing a dissertation at Purdue who basically argues that they were sort of passing through the characters they invented, like Superman and Batman, who were these very waspy, you know, un-Jewish figures. And it seemed to me that with their animation, the Franco brothers, with their animation, you know, they were sort of passing as well, first in Egypt with these Egyptian characters, but then in France with the Danube. Seriously, that's not going to be the most popular theme in post-war France, but in any event, that you know, it's like Disney quality stuff. But I really wondered sort of about the choice of something about Strauss and the Danube, and I don't know if you could discuss.
I mean, certainly, I don't know if I can discuss it, but I noticed the same thing, and I thought it was amazing because the early work is clearly, I mean, I think, and Disney oriented. In the film, they talk about Fleischer's work and the sort of childlike humor. But Jenny does look a lot like Betty Boop, for sure. And, you know, as we were watching, because, well, Lexa Group in France, and we had seen Mish Mish, but we never really thought about it. And the passing, of course, Mish Mish has his fez at first, and then he shifts over to France and grabs his beret. I was also struck by the Blue Danube, and maybe Mo, you have some great animation film intertext or story to give to us there, but absolutely, I was nearly stunned. But in terms of the and I saw why they used it as the last chapter, because it's that final dream. But in terms of that progression, it's whiter and whiter. Yes.
I think in the Blue Danube must have been, maybe I get the years wrong, but Disney's Fantasia, right? It's probably based on that film, right? I mean, they're kind of continuing the.
Yeah, they're 64.
Yeah, 64, right? So
Yeah.
it definitely has to do with Disney's Fantasia. Yeah.
Yeah, I
If
think
can
you're-
add, sorry, Bob, go ahead.
I think you're right, but the tradition of interspersing both classical music and jazz and with cartooning, I mean, they're entwined like that. So, and the other thing about the Blue Danube is it would not necessarily be associated with Germany. And, so there's this whole echoing of the importation of the waltz into French culture. And, it is via some of the French composers for the comic opera, it becomes almost French.
Right. It was hard not to see that though, and cringe a tiny bit. Because we have so few films on Mizrahi Jews, and given the absence, of, there's a different ethnic cleansing going on here, right? So there's no Holocaust here, but there is an ethnic cleansing, but there's absolutely no allusion to the role of Germany, even though we get to Blue Danube, in Egypt at the time that they're moving out. So Norm, I couldn't miss that either and kind of cringe, but I had a feeling it was much more filmic.
I didn't cringe on that. I mean, I just took it as an odd kind of, inclusion. I just want to say one thing, and is that I do really like your reference to the restoration. So let's say the master narrative of the film is about restoration, and I think it's a very powerful metaphor here to look at this material. But the other component, which I've been thinking about a lot, is like how derivative this material is. Like, it's okay, so it's the Arab Disney, the Islamic Disney, whatever. But it just strikes me looking at it, there's absolutely nothing original here. I think that it's simply, if you excuse the expression, parroting what Disney and others were doing. And am I correct in saying this, that it's
Well, first of all, I would have no clue since I'm not an animation specialist. But given that I read a few pieces, obviously there's all kinds of, allusions back and forth. A lot of it is derivative. I think what's most extraordinary about them, or what their claim to fame is that they put together a cartoon production industry by themselves with the spit and string in Cairo, Cambo, Cairo, and Alexandria at this time. So I don't know that it's going to have great acclaim on the one hand. On the other hand, people remember Mish Mish. People know Mish Mish. The name changes if you're in Francophone or in the Middle East, and as does the attire, but they remembered it. So I do think the restoration is important. So thanks for that. And the restoring the multiple stories. But for me, what was most interesting, because I'm not a big animation person, really was the handling of these immigration stories, especially on the heels of a different Francophone immigration story going in the other direction. So yeah, I don't know. I couldn't actually, I have to agree with Norm on one little thing though. When a German is the head of the secret police, it's in Egypt, it's kind of hard to not think about it. you know, when they're leaving, when you see Blue Danube at the end and you know that they've suffered this uprooting. So, I know somebody was going to say something, but I couldn't.
Maureen wanted to say
I was just going to say something about animation, is that they stayed with the kind of animation that Disney was doing in the 30s.
In the 50s and 60s.
Yeah, which was in fact itself very interesting to maintain. People liked that
Charm.
drawn style, and Disney went to the cell animation, the multi-planes, the, you know, it's a completely different aesthetic. And here, what they hold on to is the aesthetic of hand-drawn animation in really wonderful ways.
And there's nostalgia for it.
Yeah.
It's really charming. And, you know, you probably noticed this too, Mo, just from listening to Anne-Marie Baron story, who's a film critic, and about this idyllic, you know, for her, it's Tunisia, right? This idyllic Egypt that's lost, that they're, you know, hanging on to. And, you know, one of the characters or one of the cousins says, you know, chez nous en Egypte, at our home in Egypt, when they're in France or in Israel. So an uncanny home, obviously. Any other comments? I love the work with the photography and the sort of merging back and forth between photo, animation, and film. I thought their home movies were fabulous on Pathé Film, which looked great. Any other comments, questions?
I thought just the you know, putting Egypt as a country, you know, as a land that had such a lively Jewish population, you know, even for kind of a little short time in terms of history, it was very interesting. I mean, we constantly talk. We mentioned Mizrahi Jews. The family is not. Remember, the Frenkels are not Mizrahi, but they kind of you know, rolled into Egypt and really settled in and felt comfortable. So it's interesting how it's not, you know,
They become Mizrahi. They become Mizrahi once they're in France. They're Ashkenaz, but once they're in France, they're not Ashkenaz. But I noticed the archival footage here of the city reminded me a lot of Demona Twist, when they were trying to show how modern and how inclusive and what the Jewish neighborhoods looked like in Morocco versus here. And yes, it's that, you know, image of, you know, modern North Africa and a multi-ethnic and certainly Jewish.
And for those who haven't seen Demona Twist, you're really missing something. It's a superior documentary.
Yeah. Both Demona Twist and I think Israel Y, which are, for me, the sort of, for what we have, really interesting looks at Moroccan Jews in Israel and in France. But I was happy to see this one coming in. I'm happy to see more that deal with what will become Mizrahi Jews. And, you know, in Israel, they're Sephardi, or she's Sephardi, whereas in France, they are Mizrahi.
Yeah, it's like an initiation process. I don't think many of the Jews who lived in Egypt at the time were actually Egyptian Jews, unlike Moroccan Jews who spent a lot of time, right? It was sort of, they were wandering and immigrating from other European countries into Egypt for that short period in the 20th century.
Jews were in Egypt for a long time and had come over from Spain and Portugal much earlier. And then, yes, in the end of the 19th century, right around the canal, you'll have an influx again into an area that has already had Jews there for a long time. And it seems to be another haven. When in fact, 48 and Israel will disrupt that, much as it did in the rest of North Africa and, you know, most Arab countries, right? There just aren't many Jews anymore. Egypt's making a little bit of an effort. Morocco is making an effort. right now to bring back and recognize the contributions of their Jews to their history and sort of under national banners, which seems to have been the case in this very happy story, where she does manage to restore all of the films. So her fundraising was great, but with Yael Abakasis, I'm sure it would be. So,
Another metaphor that I thought was worthwhile pointing out, and that is the explosive nature of the material. The fact that the material is very brittle and easily can catch fire is very dangerous. I know in the States, you're not allowed to travel on roads with that kind of
And
material.
yeah.
And in fact, and it has, both as a physical quality of how volatile the material is, but also the, I think, cultural and intellectual quality of the volatility of the footage.
Yeah,
So I think on multiple levels too. I think
yeah, I was also struck, given that I have an entire archive hidden in tons of undeveloped film, thinking, do we have nitrate in the storage room? Because
No.
yes, you make bombs with it, And I was,
I mean, that's
Yeah.
what's sort of out of the timeline, because by the sound period, everything's safety film.
well, they clearly had some older stuff in that,
Exactly,
yeah,
exactly.
that warehouse.
But
I thought the restorations were beautiful. I thought they did an
Um,
amazing job.
it's also very exciting when they go to the whatever's called the National Academy, whatever, where there's some restoration to be done, and they're showing the screening the material. I thought of what an exciting moment that is to actually see the restored footage, projected. So,
It's the dream. I mean, and that for the documentarist, it's the dream. She
Yeah.
gets the idea, she follows the restoration, and then she gets to show the restoration to the family. You don't get better than that. So it was, not only beautiful editing, but the way she went at the story, I thought was beautiful. And I love the transitions in the chapters from stills from stills to the animation to photos of the landscape and out into the film. I thought it was sort of fabulous, and looking with great envy at their editor.
Norm, we should really try and acquire this for our collection.
Okay.
I think it's a good film to use for teaching.
Did anybody else sense, maybe this was just me, did anyone else sense almost this, I don't know, maybe I'm overseeing it, this almost deliberate ambiguity about 1948. Everything is terrific, wonderful, and then you get this iconic Palestine Post headline about Israeli independence, and everything goes to hell in Egypt, as if Zionism really is the problem with the Egyptian government, and of course it is, but there was a pogrom in 1945 on the anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, and there was all the stuff, the certain level of collaboration and in World War II, and not that it's part of the story or anything, but it is the background of the story, and it is the background as to why they left. The geopolitical aspect of it, it struck me as almost deliberately ambiguous, but then again, maybe I'm seeing it wrong.
No, I mean, I agree, and I might not have brought it out as much, but I thought what was interesting about 48 is that is a turning point, and Egyptian Jews, like French or Francophone Egyptian Jews, okay? And if you see when she has one of the guests over, she's going to speak Arabic to him, but Francophone Egyptian Jews tended to be less Zionist. She wanted to go to Israel. Like French Jews, they want to go to France. Algerian Jews, the split will be between Israel and France, but most will go to France, but their ties to 48 as a watershed, so it's super important, their ties to Israel will be completely transformed by this because the families will split. So the relationship, well, France's relationship with Israel, if you will, is becoming a little bit more distant post 56. Their relationships, the relationships of the Jews who are moving, are being created on a daily basis as their families separate. So she clearly wanted to go to Israel. They were more culturally attuned to and thought they'd do better in France. But what's interesting in the actual story, and I don't think it made it into the film, is that they become religious when they go to France. And so she's not able to visit Israel because in theory, according to Chabad, if she goes, she has to stay. So there's a great deal of bitterness. And it also poignantly shows, this division, all of those Francophone Jews, and they, have to decide between France and Israel. But many are not Zionists. They still buy into France as the happy home for the emancipated Jew, and an easier place for them to integrate, and just a place where the infrastructure is already in place. And they're talking to their relatives, and I don't know, but those who got shipped off to Dimona from Dimona Twist, since we were talking about it, certainly wouldn't have been giving back a whole lot of good news about what their welcome is like in Israel either, or at least the
I have to
welcome.
wonder even if even the animation equipment would have made it to Israel. I mean, would they really end up being?
No, they would have gone off to a
Israel?
settlement town, most
Oh, yeah.
likely, because they would have been identified. But they might have had a slightly higher, a slightly warmer welcome as Egyptians in Israel, as Egyptian Jews in Israel, than in France, because the pecking order is different.
The upper class Egyptian Jews spoke French, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's why he thought it would be easy for them. But there's levels within that, number one, and they're still going to fall below the Algerian Jews. I mean,
Sure.
in practice.
I mean, what would their occupations have been when they got to France?
Do you mean for them?
Yeah.
Okay, so right, they wanted to be filmmakers, and we don't actually hear how he ends up making his living or theirs.
Or he tells us, no, he tells us like their big hit, the Blue Dandy.
But that's just the thing. The people who come over as citizens, it's going to be easier for them to work, Algerians. And then as you go through the various communities that come over, so say Moroccan Jews, you have one level that came over, and they came over for their financials. They're privileged. They will integrate much better. But those who came later in the 60s or after 62, they will have a much harder time climbing that class structure. So even though this film is interesting also because even though Atou Fakaï makes it look great in France, this film really shows that it's a much more difficult road to travel, but also that the community in France, which we don't always think about, it's extremely diverse. It is no longer dominantly Ashkenaz. And yet there are still differences and tensions between that community or among that community. So.
But what would be a typical occupation?
Oh, I didn't answer you. Sorry. Thank you. So Moroccans are going to come over. There's going to be doctors, professionals, etc. And then they're going to be doing labor. It's the 60s. So what are they going to be doing labor on? The North African and more working class Jews who come over who do not have family connections, into the sentiers or, into the fabric rag business or some other trade. They're going to be building the cité, the banlieue, the construction. There's a mass need for labor going on, I guess until the 70s crash.
The French car company.
Yeah, until the 70s crash. But it's going to be labor. And it certainly doesn't seem that any of them, given that they're betting on horses to finance their film, have done very well. But I didn't get a clear indication. And like I said, it was a distracting week, so I didn't.
But they weren't professionals. They weren't lawyers. like working as government officials, or I'm asking the question. I mean,
I don't think I understood it or heard it.
in other words, what would they have done besides that? I mean, would they have gotten jobs in government and in the civil service and
Well, probably not. As a first call, they would be doing labor. They would likely be doing labor. I mean, not necessarily them, and I don't know what they did, but I'm talking about those who came over who weren't already professionals. And even professionals took a big, take a big step down. If you think about A Touch Away, I think you know that one, right? A Touch Away is a series about the Russians coming into Israel, and you have the father doctor who can't work. He's working as a garage attendant. So you're going to have much of the same thing for those who don't already have their own connections, and the disillusionment that we read about, we hear in the brother's letters, we hear in the mother. I'm assuming are because they thought that they had the connections to make it when they came to France, and that didn't work out. And certainly, given that she's asking for going upstairs to ask for money to do grocery shopping, the daughter, you understand that there are no successful individuals in here that I could see. And again, this was my first experience, and a happy experience with the film.
well, thank you, Gail.
Thank
Very
you.
helpful.
If there are no other questions, we'll all go prepare our classes for tomorrow. Thank you for coming.
Yes, thanks.
don't think-
everyone. Thanks, everyone, for coming. And thank you, Gail, for running this discussion. It was fascinating.
Thanks for-
And yeah, we'll get that movie because I really enjoyed it myself, as did everyone else. And I think there's a lot of applications for it for all of us. Tomorrow night, everyone, the film is No Hard Feelings, about the Caucasus, and the speaker will be Seth Bernstein, our new Soviet historian from the Department of History. So it'll be a chance to get to know Seth a little bit, and it's a wonderful movie as well. So I hope to see everyone here tomorrow night. Take care.
I hope I get the brochure.